Perfect. Great stuff. So thank you very much. I'm going to be talking to you about the balancing act in what we're describing today as the new normal, effectively, managing the rapid evolution of trial design whilst balancing patient need as we move forward into this. And to start off this presentation, there we go. To start off this presentation, I just wanted to give you an image of what's a simple face cloth mask, a cloth face mask, sorry. Perhaps one of the defining images of 2020. But when we look beyond this into clinical trials, for example, we can see that 30% of all clinical trials have actually switched to remote models. The pandemic has acted as a massive catalyst for change and innovation in clinical trials. We're seeing greater uptake of decentralized clinical trial models, remote clinical trials, e-tools, e-consent, both by choice, but primarily by necessity as well. And that's really what's driving change. But prior to this, I wanted to give you a brief example of an example from the 1960s. In this case trial, we're actually seeing a, so I'm struggling to see my slides. It's not moving across to me, so apologies if I'm a little bit stilted. What we're seeing is this 1960s breast screening vehicle. And at this time, the trial was designed looking at the impact of screening to prevent the advancement of breast cancer, whether or not it's having a major impact. And the patient population in this example had suddenly, due to sociodynamic changes, moved from being homemakers and people who would normally have access to be able to visit their clinics and now in the workplace. So suddenly you no longer have this ability to directly tap into this patient population. The clinical team, in fact, needed to move to where the patients are. And thus they came up with these screening vans. They could park outside these places of work where their patient population had migrated to. And it meant that these women could then participate in the trial at their own convenience during their lunch breaks, for example. So this is a really good example of where we've taken that innovation and moving it forward. So the concept of clinical trial innovation isn't new, effectively. But certainly, as I say, the pandemic itself has been a huge catalyst for this. And there's some good examples here. And I use uMotif, for example, as one of the patient tools, but there's plenty of other devices all doing different elements of this. And partly this is because we're seeing the necessity of this. And if we look at primary care consultations when individuals are saying that we simply don't have the interest and the uptake from patients to provide remote consultations, either from a clinician or an academic's perspective, as well as from a patient's perspective, I think this is something we can potentially challenge. If we look at Babylon Health and the GP at Hand tool, which was used in London, for example, this was designed to be a remote consultation with your GP practice. Now, initially, I say this is pre-pandemic, there was quite a bit of pushback from GPs and the Royal College of General Practitioners saying that it's not quite the same as having a face-to-face consultation. It was difficult to read body language, elements were being missed, potentially putting patients at risk. However, where the GP at Hand was being rolled out across London, patients were simply speaking with their feet. They were very rapidly enrolling onto this new way of working because it suited them with their lifestyles, largely kind of a fairly young population in London, kind of working age, who don't necessarily have the time to leave work and go to their GP practice, especially if they are migrating from central London out into the suburbs. So being able to register with their GP and speak to them at their leisure from the comfort of their own personal device was seen as a huge boon. And certainly as we've moved into the pandemic, we've become a more digitally savvy nation, I'd say. Again, by necessity being the key word here, we are socializing using video conferencing platforms, which are previously kind of limited to the corporate environment, utilizing series such as Zoom and Skype, for example, to meet with friends and family. Certainly, I've been engaging with my parents on Skype, which previously hadn't really used. So the concept of saying that this is a new technology we're not all ready for, I think we're going to see this as being embedded as very much a normal way of working. But when we're talking about clinical trial innovation, we're looking beyond that academic and clinical aspect. We're starting to look up uptake of nudge theory and gamification, for example. And again, when I mentioned about the use of e-tools earlier, such as e-diaries, and ways of recording and inputting our own remote monitoring, We're capturing this by creating leaderboards, Q&A, forum points, etc., of that kind of patient community setting within there. And that's that concept of gamification. We're just tapping into those little endorphin releases when we get praise for doing simple things, which are very easy to implement. And these actually help with adherence to a certain extent. They're not necessarily going to overcome some of the key challenges we're seeing with retention and adherence, but this is all part of things we're starting to embed and become more intelligent in the trial design and using these electronic tools. Another kind of symbol of 2020 is inevitably going to be vaccines and how these are used. And we're looking at new ways of improving the patient experience. If we look at this buzzy tool, for example, it just vibrates and cools the area where the injection is going to be taking place. And arguably, it's quite cute. It's designed for children, but adults can use it too. It's a nice, simple tool to improve that patient experience. But looking further afield, we're also starting to explore areas such as virtual and augmented reality. And again, in this particular example, they've created that gamification element of this to help reduce that stress and pressure on that pediatric participant. Furthermore, we're looking at logistics of clinical trials using Uber, for example, to transport participants to and from their clinical trial area. And again, Uber is a great example because you can see your driver, you know where they are, it's nice and transparent. It can be done, again, via a participant's phone or on their behalf, and they have access to that information. Amazon, for example, have been delivering the test and trace services on behalf of NHS England to people's homes to enable them to do the COVID testing. And in the future, I have no doubt that we'll start seeing organisations like Deliveroo, familiar organisations, for example, also supporting that logistics and delivering medication to people's homes. And certainly in the US, for example, Amazon are using drones, for example, to support delivery of medication to remote settings. But changes ultimately don't have to be huge, as we can see with this Boston Children's Hospital MRI device. They've simply put a lick of paint on the walls, and again, it's changed that patient's perception of that experience. So we can all agree that these are being designed to improve patient retention, recruitment, and engagement. But are we designing these tools with patients? Or due to the haste, are we designing them simply for patients? We're making the challenges of assumptions and falling into the common pitfalls where prior to this, we were talking about the need for patient centricity. And with the speed of development, are we now moving into designing products which are suitable for what we presume to be the needs of patients and their desire to participate in clinical trials? Are we falling down into, say, those common pitfalls where we're actually creating new barriers and new exclusions which didn't previously exist whilst overcoming previous ones? So it's important to look at the expectations we're placing on participants in their need to enroll into clinical trials. We're designing trials which we expect the participants to fit the protocol rather than designing protocols which will fit the patients and their lifestyles. An example of this, for example, is where I was supporting a clinical trial which had multiple colonoscopies. The standard of care is 1 per year, and this particular trial had 3. And we recognise it's going to be a major challenge for participants to be involved in that trial. It's obviously quite an unpleasant, invasive procedure, and therefore individuals were quite rightly going to be very off-put from participating. They'd see this as a major barrier. The feedback we had was it wasn't actually the procedure, that was the assumption we made. It was the lead up to the procedure, which was going to be one of those major obstacles to participation. In fact, they have to take quite a heavy duty laxative, for example, that they'd need to take this a day in advance. They'd be fasting, it's difficult to hide, they'd be doing it at work, which would raise questions and make them feel uncomfortable. So it wasn't a procedure, it was something outside of that which we hadn't really considered. So it's elements like that we really need to kind of consider, and of course I'll touch on this in a moment. But also the idea around flexibility is also true. When we're talking about home visits, for example, certainly a key part of that decentralized or remote or virtual clinical trials. That's incredibly important kind of central element of that, or at least in some instances, and certainly the direction of travel. But when I've spoken to some individuals who said, actually, that wouldn't work for me. These are individuals having quite intensive medical procedures, for example, some in oncology. And they said, actually, I'd much rather have my house, my own home as that sanctuary element, effectively. The concept of keeping this separate and having the clinical environment where I have these things done to me effectively, and then my home, where my children are as well, is kept separate, and I can try and balance those two together. Another individual was saying to me that they were kind of person who had a cleaner, but they'd clean up prior to the cleaner coming around, so they didn't feel embarrassed. They're a bit of a perfectionist. And when they were feeling particularly unwell or didn't feel they're able to kind of maintain that kind of standard, having someone coming into their house and seeing them vulnerable in that position would make them feel extremely uncomfortable, which is obviously complete opposite what we're trying to achieve. But when we're considering the pandemic itself as well, one individual who was immunocompromised was saying, well, a number of these people said, well, it'll be useful to see who will be becoming effectively the research nurse, to get information on them, what they look like, so I know when they arrive, I know exactly who they are before they come into the house. Whereas one individual was saying that because they've been shielding since the start of the pandemic, the concept of someone coming into their house and putting them at risk would be anathema to them. They simply weren't happy with that. So again, it's that balancing act of trying to ensure these considerations are met, and we're not creating new exclusions where we're overcoming, say, geographical exclusions. So I wanted to briefly touch on patient-reported outcomes as well. The concept of the two ways of looking at these, from additional clinical methodologies, where very robust, we're meeting key points defined by clinicians, for example, compared to those defined by patients who often have considerations about quality of life. So the idea that a treatment may increase someone's quantity of life, but ultimately from a participant side, what they really want is just not to ache when they get up in the morning. And a perfect example of this, I'm sure many of you may be aware of, is Pfizer's inhalable insulin. And this was a device designed to reduce the number of self-injections that a diabetic patient would have to take. It was quite a large device, which, so you'd be able to take an inhalable rather than self-injecting. Now, the problem with this was, the size of the device was impractical. Certainly if you were out and about, for example, it wouldn't fit in a pocket or a handbag easily. At the same time, the syringes had become easier to use, and patients also had concern about with the inhalable, they were unable to control, or at least feel they had the control of how much insulin they were actually absorbing into their body. When using a liquid syringe, it's nice and easy to monitor that and control that themselves. And therefore, the trial itself was, although the product was released at great expense, it was ultimately a bit of a flop, an incredibly expensive one as well. So that's a perfect example where a medical device has been created under the assumption that it will resolve a problem, which patients are actually managing themselves and have different solutions in mind. So we recognize that involving patients right at the beginning of the clinical design process, the protocol development stage, has the potential to improve study delivery, improving study design, recruitment, and ultimately adherence to the patient experience. Patients are the experts of their own condition. And as part of that, we need to work out why we're struggling to involve them in these conversations right from the very beginning. And again, some of this comes down to the sheer speed and necessity of the uptake of new ways of working. But even prior to this, there's been a number of underlying issues which have sometimes acts as a bit of a barrier for that level of engagement. There's a patient concern and varied understanding about commercial clinical trials. They can be seen as being a bit of a faceless entity, effectively very much kind of financially driven rather than for patient benefit. The regulatory pathway and managing these and actually speaking directly to patients can be quite tricky. In the UK, we have the ABPI Code of Conduct and HRA guidelines, but when modeled on top with companies' kind of global ways of working, it can become quite difficult to navigate, quite labyrinthian. There's also the issue of patient reimbursement, fair market value, what counts as bribery or even coercion, A colleague of mine described this very much as being a Wild West scenario of either no payment of a £5 Amazon voucher right through to several £100 being bandied around. There's no agreed national way of working for this. We also come across very heavy-handed legalities and CDAs, for example, with one individual describing to me at one point where the document was so heavy-handed it pretty much threatened to sue him if he was to break that CDA by having a conversation with someone in a cafe about his experiences. This is incredibly off-putting for participants who ultimately want to be involved in their own healthcare, want to support us as an industry to design better trials. So it's something we need to move away from and create smarter, more patient-friendly documentation. And of course, there's also the challenge of handling patient-identifiable data and GDPR. So taking a deeper drill into trust, for example. Unfortunately, the life sciences is pretty much down at the bottom, or has been for a number of times with regards to uptake in clinical trials. In a poll in the US a couple of years ago now, the life sciences rated one of the least trusted industries in the US, below car manufacturing and the Trump administration at that point as well. Following on for this, we have academic-led clinical trials, and at the very top of that trust tree, I suppose, will be the NHS in the UK. People with the COVID-19 outbreak, I think that dynamic is beginning to shift. Certainly life sciences isn't going to be overcoming those other two areas in that triangle, but certainly the trust and engagement with life science research has improved. And part of the reason for this is with the research into COVID-19, the forthcoming vaccine trials, even if we still see anti-vax movements, for example, and other conspiracy theories which are undermining that idea of trust. But ultimately some of the humanitarian reasons for the design of these trials, and likewise the sheer level of press coverage, positive press coverage going on about these trials is helping that idea, creating people have more knowledge, greater understanding, which will inevitably lead to greater uptake of clinical trials. We also need to talk about the language we use when speaking to patients, whether this be in engagement sessions or just in general, because sometimes we're very prone to using the wrong language for this. The term patient itself is a bit of a hierarchical status. It can open up areas where we're creating pity, for example, rather than empathy. Well, we potentially want to use terms like participant. We use the term suffering with rather than living with, for example. And this can be, from an internal to companies, can be a bit of a concern when regarding are staff able to speak to patients? Are they fully trained to do this? When in reality, we just need to put a bit more kind of humanity and empathy when doing this and be less concerned about this rather than kind of shielding or bubbling ourselves around a kind of a layer of lawyers effectively. But it's also important to talk about site centricity. We're working with sites to manage multiple vendors and solution providers effectively. If we're asking a research clinician to log into multiple different devices which don't all talk to each other, it can be a huge pain for both the clinical team and patients alike. At a recent example, there was a CI I was supporting who mentioned when working with a major CRO that he'd been handed an intricate web of stuff, and I quote, of stuff that simply didn't talk to each other. And imagine that from a patient's perspective. Again, it was Carol was mentioning about the use of various different technologies if they don't have a smartphone, for example. What we need to do is help create devices, or rather applications or e-diaries, whatever it may be, which can simply plug and play. I, for example, have a smartphone and a tablet and laptop with different, sometimes overlapping applications on these. I'm familiar with these devices because they're mine. If I'm enrolling into a clinical trial and I'm given an e-diary, I want to be able to use it on my device because I know what I'm doing. It's very easy to connect and play with effectively. Likewise, if I don't have those devices, I'd like something nice and bespoke, which is very easy to use, which can be provided to me. And this does become an issue of cost, of course. But again, this is something we need to factor in. It doesn't need to be an expensive device, just nice and easy to use. And that's where that flexibility, that option need to come in. So again, we're not unintentionally excluding individuals from participating. We're trying to make trials more accessible, easier to use. And ultimately, this can be used to increase adherence with clinical trials and uptake. I want to give you an example of the Imagine device created by Leo Pharma. And this is a skin device effectively for monitoring a skin condition. And it was really quite an ingenious device because it was enabled the participant to take pictures of the skin lesion, for example, or the atopic dermatitis, and they could send that over to their clinical team, the research team. But rather than excluding the participant from being able to see that information, it was shared with both of those groups. The clinical team could do the analysis of this, and from the participant side, they could take daily pictures, and they're building up a photo library. But the true key design for this factor was that over time, that participant could take a sliding scale and see the change in their condition over time, which meant that they were more engaged with that because they could actively see the benefit. And likewise, the clinical team as well could show those endpoints as being reached. And that's a great example of where we're actively sharing results with participants without unblinding the trial or putting any individuals at risk. And we recognize that is quite a big step forward, that desire for gaining data and being involved in their own clinical trial and their own healthcare. And obviously that skin condition is something quite visible. It won't work for all trials, unfortunately, but it's something we need to bear in mind and where possible, try and embed this into our clinical trial design. So all of this is quite a daunting prospect. But thankfully, the National Institute for Health Research is here to help. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to dwell on who the NIHR is and what we do too much, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about how we can collectively overcome some of these challenges. The National Institute for Health Research is effectively part of the research environment in the UK. We're supporting the delivery of research in the NHS and the wider healthcare settings. As part of the study support service, we support the full life cycle of clinical trials from that bench to bedside methodology. But we also support with facilitate that relationship between patients and the life science industry with the NIHR Patient Engagement in Clinical Development Service, which is a service I deliver. Partnering you with patients during that clinical design stage to provide their direct input into the trial design. Or if we recognise that a patient organisation is doing this already, again, we can simply facilitate that introduction to them and we'll help you with that conversation. Because we recognise that's an incredibly important discussion to have. We've also recently launched the 5 patient recruitment centres as part of the life sciences sector deal. A focus on delivering commercial clinical trials, centres of excellence, but they're going to be hotbeds of innovation effectively, leading the way of these new ways of working. And speaking of these new ways of working, it's worth touching on the NHS vaccine registry as well. This was something designed where participants could register their interest in taking part in these new vaccine trials coming through as part of the NIHR's Be Part of Research platform. This means we could rapidly identify participants who screened and are eligible to participate in these vaccine research. But moving beyond COVID-19, looking to the future, we're looking to increase the scope of this way of working, of creating a national registry and database where we can partner patients directly to clinical trials, enabling them to screen and move through this process. So innovation is very, very rapid. I say it's been a catalyst for change. We're really pushing things forward at a great pace, and we're going to try and retain the things which work and really kind of streamline this moving forward. So what will the future look like? I don't personally know. I think it's very difficult to plan for 10 years in the future. We've done that before and we've seen what happens. We get a global pandemic sweeps through and turns everything on its head. And it is a global tragedy. But at the same time, I think we are seeing a number of advancements made in clinical research, which when we co-involve, or co-create it with patients together, we can ensure we're designing new ways of working which will benefit patients, improve the clinical research environment as a whole, lead to better clinical trials. And ultimately, a better patient experience, and to quote Carol, she said earlier on, treating patients as partners as we move forward with this rapid evolution of trial design. Thank you. I've got my contact details in there, so if you don't have any questions now, do please feel free to reach out and contact me. I'll be very happy to speak to you. Thank you.